Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name's Fran Rosenfeld, and I'm the museum's Director of Public Programs. Thanks so much for joining us on this rainy evening for tonight's conversation, Year of Upheaval, 1919 and its Legacies. We're going to talk about the trials and tensions of the monumental year of 1919 in New York City and around the nation. We are so honored to be joined tonight by a very distinguished, interesting panel, including the historians Beverly Gage and DeWeston Hayward, the author Vivian Gornick, the museum's own curator, historian Steve Jaffe, and they're going to be in a conversation moderated by historian Ted Widmer. We're delighted to be co-presenting this program with the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate Center. And by my side is the Gotham Center's director, Peter Egner, who is going to say a few words in just a moment. Tonight's program is the final event in the museum's, accompanying the museum's current exhibition, City of Workers, City of Struggle, How Labor Movements Changed New York. And this exhibition, which is curated by our panelist, Steve Jaffe, chronicles how countless waves of workers, women, immigrants, people of color, and the so-called unskilled have long struggled over pay, power, and inclusion. If you didn't get the chance to see the exhibition before the program, we invite you to come back anytime before it closes on January 5th. We're open every day of the week, 10 to 6. And you can find out more online. Just a little plug for an upcoming program that I think many in this audience would be interested in here at the museum. In 2 weeks, we have a festival from Friday, November 22nd to Sunday, November 24th, just before Thanksgiving, called the Vibe of the Village Festival. And it's a weekend-long celebration of the creative legacy of the alternative weekly, The Village Voice, and the spirit of downtown New York in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the festival features live music from both emerging and established artists, conversations with former Voice contributors, poetry performances, films, food and drink, etc. So if you're interested, please check out our website, mcny.org/vibe. And now I'm going to ask you to silence anything that buzzes or beeps, but I encourage you to tweet away using our hashtags MCNYLive and at Gotham Center. This, yes, if this is a social media using crowd. After the panel, we please invite you to stick around for a glass of wine. There'll be more wine in the back. And now I'm going to turn this over to our co-presenter, Peter Egner, who can also say what the run of show is for the evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Fran. I'm not going to say too much, but thank you, Fran. It's a pleasure to be up here presenting the Gotham Center for New York City History. For some of you I think some of our members are here tonight, but for those of you who don't know, is the only academic center devoted to New York City history. And we regularly do events like this at CUNY's Graduate School in Midtown, but it's nice to be off campus. Thank you for your help, and thank you for everyone for participating tonight. I invite you to visit us on the web. You can learn more about our programming. We have a suite of programs for public education and a burgeoning suite of programs for scholars and research. I'm just going to introduce our moderator, Ted Widmer, who is going to then introduce the panel and kick us off. Ted is a Carnegie Council Senior Fellow and the creator of 1919, The Year of the Crack-Up, a special podcast and New York Times series about the events of 1919 around the world. He is an historian, a writer, a librarian, a musician, and a distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York. His books include Listening In, The Secret White House Tapes of John F. Kennedy, Campaigns, A Century of Presidential Races, co-published, or edited or co-authored with Alan Brinkley, the distinguished Alan Brinkley, and Young America, The Flowering of Democracy in New York City. So please join me in welcoming Ted to the stage, who will introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Fran. Thank you all for coming out tonight for this exciting panel in the year 1919. We had a moment backstage where the historians on the panel were talking in a relaxed way before the event started, saying, can you believe how much is happening every day. The news is crazy. It's hard to take it all in. And then we paused. We didn't realize if we were talking about 1919 or 2019. And in a way, that's the idea. We want to get to the root of things tonight, and we have a wonderful panel that will help us to do that. So they will each present, beginning with Steve Jaffe, who will do a PowerPoint, and then 3 other panelists, and then we will have some conversation among the panelists, and then we invite audience questions for Q&A from everybody. So in alphabetical order, I'll introduce everyone. Beverly Gage is a professor of 20th century American history and director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy at Yale University. Her forthcoming biography of J. Edgar Hoover is called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the American Century. She's also the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in the First Age of Terror, and a contributing writer in the New York Times Magazine. Vivian Gornick's a prolific memoirist, essayist, and biographer. She's the author of many books, including Emma Goldman, Revolution as a Way of Life, The Solitude of Self, Thinking About Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Odd Woman in the City, and Fierce Attachments, which was selected by the New York Times as the #1 best memoir of the past 50 years. DeWeston Hayward is Associate Professor of History at Hunter College at CUNY, specializing in 20th century American history. His research and teaching center on Black protest movements and protest thought, Black cultural politics, Black social institutions and public spheres, gender and Black masculinity, and ideas of race and revolution in the Black diaspora. He's the author of Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press, and A Manly Vision for Racial Advancement. And last, but he's actually presenting first, is my friend and former colleague, Stephen Jaffe, who's a historian and curator here at the Museum of the City of New York, where his many exhibitions include City of Workers, City of Struggle, How Labor Movements Changed New York. Other books include Activist New York, A History of People, Protests, and Politics, and New York at War, 4 Centuries of Combat, Fear, and Intrigue in Gotham. So please welcome Stephen Jaffe.
So, I'm trying to get the gizmo to work. Right hand. Nope. Good evening. Thanks, Ted. Let's see. Okay. Technical difficulties. Is this not turned on? Ah.
I have a feeling someone never turned it on.
Yeah, so we're having trouble. How many historians and public, museum people does it take to activate devices? Here we go. Okay. I want you to imagine yourselves sitting exactly where you're sitting at this very moment, but it is, in fact, the evening of August 23rd, 1918, at which time where you're sitting was basically an empty lot facing Central Park. But if you had sort of looked over your right shoulder and across 104th Street, about a third of the way down the block, you would have seen the tenement at 5 East 104th Street. And you'll see on the left of the slide here what it looks like now. And you would have seen New York policemen converging on this site and arresting 4 Russian Jewish immigrant leftists. What were they being arrested for? They were being arrested for the words in red that you see there that were printed on a leaflet which they were responsible for distributing in the streets of Lower Manhattan the previous day. And you can see from the words what they're in essence urging is for war workers, because this is still August 1918, we're still in World War I. They're urging war workers to basically put down their tools in protest and to strike in protest against the Wilson administration's new policy of sending American troops into Russia. This is still, again, we're still fighting the Germans on the Western Front. But Wilson has sent troops, American troops, to Russia to try to help put down the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik government, which has been in power for almost a year at this point. This leaflet violates, in the ultimate estimation of authorities, the Sedition Act, the Federal Sedition Act of 1918, which basically allowed prosecutors and the government to crack down on any speech or publications that could be argued were impeding the war effort or criticizing the government. Ultimately, these 4 individuals, 3 anarchists and 1 socialist, who were arrested across the street that night, were sentenced from 15 to 20 years in prison for their leaflets, which were printed both in English and Yiddish. This case goes from 104th Street to the U.S. Supreme Court. It becomes Jacob Abrams v. U.S., 1919, in which the court upholds the conviction of these 4. Eventually, they are deported to Russia in 1921. But the case is also, if you know anything about First Amendment law, this case becomes a very important one because of the dissenting opinion by Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, which lays a basis for a later, broader, we would consider more liberal interpretation of First Amendment rights of expression. And I would argue that in microcosm, these events on 104th Street kind of summarize or give us a lead-in to the larger events of 1919 in New York and around the country. It's a year of great political repression and suppression. It weakens the left in New York and around the country for years to come. But even so, from a New York City vantage point, the city will remain an incubator of political dissent and expression. So what is the context for these arrests on 104th Street and the leaflet? New York City, in the years both before and during World War I, is a city of leftist agitation, protest, organization, anarchists, socialists, the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, and in 1919 actually, the founding of 2 communist parties in the United States, which eventually merged into 1. You can see from these pictures here that during World War I, the leftist agitation was directed against the war as a capitalist bloodbath. And ultimately, with the founding of the Bolshevik regime in Russia, championing also the new allegedly freeing, emancipating Soviet regime. You see these amazing works of art generated in for the Masses magazine, the socialist magazine associated with Greenwich Village, Mother Earth, which of course was Emma Goldman's and Alexander Berkman's anarchist publication, and The Liberator, which was an early communist publication. There's an additional different context for 1919 in New York, which we'll also be hearing about tonight from our other speakers. Red Summer, which was really the wave of pogroms that white Americans meted out against African Americans in a period of great upheaval, tension. Black Americans are on the move. They are both socially and geographically mobile, partly because of the war, drawn to cities for war industries. Meanwhile, Black Harlem is becoming the hub of African American descent. And A. Philip Randolph, a young socialist, is co-editor of The Messenger in Harlem. And The Messenger has its own activist slant on what's happening to Black Americans. This cartoon you see on the right is from The Messenger in 1919. The new crowd Negro making America safe for himself. That's a sarcastic, ironic riff on Woodrow Wilson's saying that, U.S. is joining World War I to make the world safe for democracy. And if you look at this image, 40 years before Malcolm X, A. Philip Randolph and his comrades are urging black American men, in particular, to defend themselves against white racist violence. And so the new Negro is gunning after the whites on the right-hand side who have been lynching. And again, the irony, giving the Hun a dose of his own medicine, because of course the Hun was the term during World War I directed at Germans, pejoratively. Randolph and his comrades are using it to turn against white American racists. So New York is an incubator of this kind of dissent, protest, and agitation. 1919 in New York and around the country is also a year of tremendous strikes and labor conflicts. Labor comes out, organized labor, unions come out of the war seeking to defend benefits that they had gained by being part of the war effort. Employers are just as bent on rolling back those gains, and there are clashes all across the country. Many of them, of course, as you probably know, lead to the weakening. They fail, strikes and union drives fail. And there are a few, however, that do succeed. In New York, for example, Actors' Equity leads a strike which brings 5-year contract. But it's a year where, as you see, 4 million American workers went on strike. Ultimately, the short answer is it weakens the labor movement in the face of an onslaught by manufacturers and other employers who want the open shop. It's worth, in passing, mentioning the fact that in New York and elsewhere, a minority on the left are embracing the use of revolutionary terror as a tactic. If capitalism is daily violence, then it requires revolutionary violence in response. This goes even back before the war. Those of you who came here tonight by getting off the subway at the 6 train station at Lexington Avenue and 103rd were basically at the corner that you see on the left. That's Lexington and 103rd. And on July 4th, 1914, a bomb accidentally detonated at the top of that building and blew it apart. An anarchist, Arthur Caron, who you see in the newspaper, was apparently planning this bomb to use against the Rockefellers, who were seen as great enemies of labor at this time due to strikes out west, violent suppression of strikes by Rockefeller-affiliated mining companies. But this tradition, if you will, of revolutionary violence, propaganda by the deed, sort of is reborn in the spring and early summer of 1919 when there are a rash of anarchist bombings, including 36 letter bombs sent from New York to leading capitalists and officials. And of course, this wave of terror serves to really discredit the left rather than augment its power. The irony being that the only people killed were a domestic servant, an African-American domestic servant who opened one of these letter bombs inadvertently in the South, and a night watchman who was killed in New York while guarding the home of the judge who was targeted. So that's the radical city. Just briefly, there's the other city, the pro-war city that was triumphant through the war. World War I economically was, by and large, very, very, very good for New York City and for America in the sense that it dragged the country out of a recession, a severe recession that had started in 1913. You see the various superlatives that I've listed here. The war is good for employment. It's good for Wall Street. It's good for production. And that continues into the post-war period. You see in the two images there, on the left, there are lighthearted moments during the war. That's Charlie Chaplin being held aloft by Douglas Fairbanks. These guys are already international stars of the silent screen. They're selling war bonds. They're promoting US war bonds on Wall Street in front of a crowd of thousands. There's the other side that's less lighthearted, which is a kind of strident militarism, a hyper-patriotism. You see it, Fifth Avenue on the right there. This is actually even before we joined the war. This is Flag Day 1916, and the big sign says, absolute and unqualified loyalty to our country. That means all you radicals in New York, all you immigrants, you Germans, you Austrians, you Russian Jews who don't like the Tsar, even though he's an ally, you Irish who are anti-English, you got to toe the line if we go to war on the side of England and France and Tsarist Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This leads, as we get into the war, 1917, 1918, to a sort of a raft of laws and prosecutions in which incendiary speech is prosecuted. The magazines and newspapers that we saw the art from, like The Masses and Mother Earth, are basically suppressed during this period. Meanwhile, on the industrial front, manufacturers, capitalists, are sort of mobilizing an anti-labor, anti-organized labor argument by intimating that strikes and union activists are pro-German because they're holding back the war effort. And that segues, once we're past the war after 1918, in 1918, that segues into sort of, well, all organized labor are Bolsheviks. They're really agents of or sympathizers with the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And you see that in this sort of propaganda poster on the right, with the hand of organized labor, really, and sort of liberalism. And the fingers of the hand say, this is evil coming down on America, excessive taxes, unwise laws, disloyalty, agitation, waste. And basically, it's sort of liberalism and the left are evil and in the way of freedom and free enterprise. The fear and anger has an ethnic dimension, too. Very strongly so. As many of you know, there's a wave of anti-German hysteria, culturally, politically, and that also sort of bleeds into a kind of attempt to stop all un-American activities. It sort of segues into anti-Bolshevism. And the maps that you see here, these remarkable maps, were drawn up for the Lusk Committee, which was a New York State committee in the State House in Albany, out to, in a sort of McCarthyist kind of way, before the fact, sort of interrogate and surveil so-called radicals and subversives. And this map made very explicit the connection between ethnicity, immigration, race, and radicalism. So all those red zones, or maybe they look purple over here, I can't really see. They look kind of purplish or red. Those are Russian Jewish neighborhoods. Black Harlem is there too. And the other groups who are suspect, in particular, Italians have this anarchist tradition, Austro-Hungarians, Irish, and so on, are mapped. You'll notice that white Anglo-Saxons are not mapped here because the implicit argument is that white Anglo-Saxons are more or less safe, whereas these new groups are not. We're going to be hearing about the Red Scare of 1919, 1921, government backlash against the left, sort of wholesale, and against militant labor. Ultimately, non-citizen radicals, including our 104th Street Russian-born radicals, are deported. And of course, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, the great avatars of New York anarchism, are put with more than 240 others on the SS Buford, the ship you see there at the bottom, for deportation back to Russia. And there you see, Beverly was mentioning earlier that this is, well, you'll talk about that. But November 1919, exactly 100 years ago, the police ransacked the Wobblies, the IWW office on East 10th Street. and you see how tender and gingerly they treated the radical property there. So this culminates, all of this fear and suspicion and paranoia and nativism, xenophobia culminates in this Red Scare of 1919, 1921. And I just got two more images to show you, sort of go into the postscript here, sort of the overview from 1919 into the 20s. New York's right wing, after a period of progressivism that we learn about in the 1910s, the right is very energized by all of this. And for example, the guy you see on the left, John Trevor, who's the guy who helped to draft these maps for the Lusk Committee in New York State, becomes a lobbyist and a confidant of congressmen and helps bring about the 1924 immigration restriction that keeps Jews, Italians, Eastern Europeans, by and large, out of the country for the next 40 years. This is the period where New York City has a real Ku Klux Klan that marches in Queens. Some of you know that Fred Trump was arrested during one of these marches. There's a lot of back and forth, of course, about what that meant. Why was he arrested? For what set of reasons? His son, the current president of the United States, of course, denies that this ever happened. It's fake history, fake news. And last but not least, the left is weakened in New York and around the country. Organized labor is weakened. But New York being New York, despite the deportations and the imprisonments, many of the leftists and left liberals of 1919 survive and evolve to face later challenges from people like J. Edgar Hoover, and you see a kind of collage. This could have been hundreds or thousands of people. Clara Lemlich could have been here. Anyway, that's really my overview. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yep. So I introduced our panelists in alphabetical order, but they're actually speaking in non-alphabetical order. So Beverly will go first, followed by DeWeston Haywood, and then Vivian Gornick.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here tonight to mark the 100th anniversary of a dramatic year in American history. And as we were discussing a little bit before this, 1919 really was one of those years in which things just kept happening. And this country looks dramatically different at the beginning of 1919 and at the end of 1919, and I think our task up here is to figure out what happened in between. I'm just going to talk briefly about a series of events that began on November 7th, 1919. So we are now at the 100th anniversary, so this day, 100 years ago. And those were what's known as the Palmer Raids, which were already mentioned up here a little bit as a sort of signature feature of one of the great phenomena of 1919, which was the Red Scare in the United States, sometimes referred to as the first Red Scare, as a precursor to, I think, what remains the better known Red Scare of the 1940s and 1950s with Joseph McCarthy. So I'm just going to say a few words about the Palmer Raids. First of all, what they were, a little bit about why they happened, and why I think in some ways our sort of standard understanding of where it is that the Palmer Raids came from could use a little revision, and then also how it is that they came to an end. So the Palmer Raids are most famous as a series of dramatic deportation raids that, as I said, began on November 7th, 1919. On that evening, the federal authorities, so this is coming out of the Department of Justice, but working with the New York police, working to some degree with private detective agencies around the country, initiated a series of coordinated raids aimed at a very, very obscure organization known as the Union of Russian Workers. This organization had been very carefully chosen for a couple of reasons. One is that most of its members were foreign-born. Second is that they were an explicitly revolutionary anarchist organization. And then third, they were going to be having meetings that night because November 7th was a significant day, being honored as the second anniversary, the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which had happened in 1919. And the plan for that was to really sweep in to these meetings that were going on and sweep up everybody. This is a coordinated, multi-city series of raids. And in many ways, though we had seen this kind of coordinated raids before, it is a precursor of the sorts of multi-city coordinated immigration raids that we're going to see increasingly in years to come, and to some degree are seeing today. What made 1919 interesting and dramatic, I think, was not only that these were immigration raids, but that they were specifically aimed at foreign-born radicals. So on November 7th, these raids go off. The Justice Department is very, very happy to publicize them, to keep credit for them. The press comes in, covers them very heavily. And when Americans find out that the federal government in this series of coordinated raids has targeted several hundred people, pulled out and jailed in these raids, it is a wild political success. It really helps to make the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, who is at that point Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, really begins to make Palmer even more of a household name than he had been. And it's important to note that, as I said, these were enormously popular. We look back at the Palmer raids and think that these were travesties of justice, violations of civil liberties. At the time, they were widely embraced, widely celebrated as a kind of just response to a threat that many people perceived, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. It was so successful that they decided we were going to have dramatic moment number 2 in the story of the Palmer raids. That we saw I guess a photograph of the deportation that took place out of New York Harbor in December of 1919. It included several hundred of the people who had been arrested in those raids, as well as a few other assorted deportees, and of course the two most famous people on board, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. And I think Vivian Gornick's going to talk a little bit more about those folks. That too, the sailing of this ship back off to Bolshevik Russia in December of 1919 is enormously popular. The left doesn't like it. Certain civil libertarians find this questionable, but it is a widely celebrated event. And it's so celebrated that the Justice Department thinks, step number 3, we're going to do this bigger, we're going to do it even better. And so on January 2nd of 1920, a much larger round of raids happens again, nationally coordinated, this time targeting the Communist Party of the United States as well as the Communist Labor Party. These are brand new parties. Given the history of the left, of course, you don't just create one new party, you create 2 new parties who are arch rivals and hate each other, even though they basically agree with each other about everything. And this second round of Palmer raids sweeps in not hundreds of people, but in fact thousands of people. They are jailed in places like Ellis Island. They are sent, in many cases, into immigration facilities that are not at all ready to accept thousands of radicals. This, however, in contrast to the November raids, becomes hugely controversial. There's a big backlash against the Palmer raids, and while they're expecting that this is going to be a great victory for the Justice Department, in fact, it becomes a source of great criticism, becomes one of the moments that ultimately discredits A. Mitchell Palmer, and we see a massive backlash, though thousands and thousands of people had been arrested in that second round of raids. Very few of them, in the end, are deported. So I just want to say a few words about how we want to understand this series of dramatic events, which, while they were happening all over the country, really were in many ways specifically concentrated in New York. The greatest numbers of people were rounded up in New York. The major deportation of the Soviet Ark took place out of New York. And in many ways, the American imagination, particularly around anarchism and communism, is really centered in both celebration of and suspicion of what's going on in New York. And I think the standard story about how it is that we suddenly get these very dramatic deportation raids is number one, that 1919 has been a year of great turmoil, and that these are kind of hysterical outbursts, right? That people are worried about threats that don't really exist, and a demagogic politician named A. Mitchell Palmer, who is in fact wanting the Democratic nomination for president, comes in, says, this is an issue that I can ride on the backs of radicals, of immigrants, to great success, to great political prowess. I think that's been our standard story of where you get something like the Palmer raids. And it's not entirely wrong. But I want to mention a few other things that are going on that really make something like the Palmer raids possible in a way that it simply wouldn't have been possible 10 years earlier. The first of those is what happened during the war. We heard a little bit about that. A whole set of new speech laws and new laws regulating immigration that had come into being as a result of the war, and though we're now out of the war, really last into 1919 and form the legal infrastructure that makes something like the Palmer raids possible. In particular, laws that say not only can political radicals not come into the country, they can be deported once they are here, and really empowering the federal government to begin to do that. So we've got a whole new legal apparatus that's coming into being during those years that really matters. The second thing that's in place is a new administrative apparatus that actually allows the federal government to even think about trying to pull off something on this scale. Before the First World War, the federal government does some things, but it's pretty small and often quite inept. Its administrative capacity is rather limited. The war produces an enormous expansion, not only legally, but administratively. The person who I'm writing a biography of, J. Edgar Hoover, comes into federal work in 1917, straight out of law school, and the first thing that he is assigned to do when he enters the Justice Department is to intern Germans, right? So you're beginning to get all of these new people trained in the process of looking at immigrants, regulating them, rounding them up, and Hoover, who comes in not particularly dedicated to these issues, but is taught from his first moment there how to do that, and then behind the scenes, as a very young man in his 20s, really becomes the kind of administrative architect of the Palmer raids. The last piece to say is that, as the presentation suggested, there's actually a lot of radicalism, a lot of revolutionary radicalism, some of which is quite violent and quite threatening to Americans during 1919, to some degree earlier as well, and to some degree later. But 1919 is really a peak year. And I think often when we look back at the Palmer raids, we're unsympathetic to people who are worried about people who might be living here from other countries planning terrorist bombings. But of course, we've had some experience with those kinds of suspicions and concerns ourselves. So as we think back to that moment, I think it's important not simply to be kind of critical and dismissive about the way many people were responding, but to really put ourselves in their shoes and think what it was like to live through that series of events that Steve just described. Last thing that I want to say is, why did it stop when it stopped? Because for many people, when this happened in November of 1919, for the first time I said widely celebrated, it was assumed this was going to go on and on. It was going to be the way that the government and the country did business around these issues from this point on. And there too, I think we have a couple of important pieces to think about that really matter not only for that moment, but for our day. The first is that though I said you've got all these new experiments in doing this kind of thing, if not well, being able to do it in the first place, as it turned out, when they tried to scale this up in early 1920 to round up thousands of people instead of hundreds, it was a total disaster. They hadn't thought through much beyond the moment of arrest. They didn't have facilities for people. They were marching people through the streets as chain gangs. They were rounding up American citizens as well as non-citizens. So there's a real kind of administrative failure, which suggests that had they done it better, right? Had you not had all of these controversies, people locked for days in a hallway without food and water, you might have actually had a different public response. Another piece is the people who spoke out against it. And one of the really fascinating things that comes out of the war, 1919 into 1920, is the creation of institutions like the ACLU, who 100 years later are still at the cutting edge of in fact, speaking out against these sorts of things. So I think we have a variety of limiting factors actors that come in to sort of make this stop in the moment that it does, many of which have to do with people speaking out against it at moments where it was really critically important to do that, lawyers in particular, civil liberties activists. But it's also important to note that though the Palmer raids are a relatively brief episode, they do produce these ramifications over time. We've already heard about immigration restriction, which comes in the early 20s, based around some of these ideas that shaped the Palmer raids. And for my own interests, this biography that I'm writing about J. Edgar Hoover, this is the moment that he really learns to begin to conduct surveillance of radicals. And though he stops doing deportation raids because he decides that's not a good idea, people don't like that, of course, he goes on over the next 50 years, really, to continue to conduct variations on what he started in 1919.
So I'm going to be talking about black activism and radicalism and resistance at this moment. And I want to start with this. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed. In vain, then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe, though far outnumbered, let us show us brave. And for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So in September 1919, Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born writer and poet living in Harlem, published this piece, If We Must Die, in The Messenger, a black socialist newspaper published out of Harlem, which was mentioned in the presentation. McKay was reacting to the series of race riots that had erupted across the country, beginning in the spring of 1919 on through that summer, the latest of which had struck Chicago in late July and left the city smoldering in 8 days of rioting. McKay's poem was a gendered assertion of resolute black resistance, and that if we must die, it must be a noble, manly death, having fought back for one's rights. So understanding fully what McKay was saying, I think, requires us to go back a few years prior to 1919 and then a few years after, to realize that McKay and his poem were a result and reflection of broader upheavals in American history and abroad. So what had been trickles of black Southerners leaving the South for the urban North and Midwest in the early 1910s exploded into a full-on exodus by 1915. The absence of civil rights, depressed economic opportunities, racial and sexual violence pushed many black Southerners out of the South. Better job prospects brought on by Northern industries, and the closing of European immigration in 1914, and those Northern industries looking for a new source of cheap labor, but also this promise of legal rights in the North would draw many black Southerners northward. So by 1920, nearly 1 million migrants abandoned the South, and then additionally, as many as 100,000, a little over 100,000 West Indian immigrants left the global South for the United States for similar reasons. So in the face of many Southern lawmakers' attempts to stop the mass exodus, ironically, right, many migrants succeeded in finding the freedom they thought they would find in terms of political, educational, and economic opportunities. Among many urban centers that they go to, Philly, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and New York City would become, particularly Harlem, would become their new homes. There would be challenges, of course: exorbitant rents, labor exploitation, exclusions from trade unions, racially restrictive covenants, and intraracial class conflicts and cultural tensions. Yet there would also be challenges that were all too familiar. The color line, this pithy metaphor and euphemism for a far more drastic problem, racial oppression, this uniquely insidious thing. The color line was a real and imaginary line, fixed and movable line that could be imposed any and everywhere by any white person against any non-white person. So when white people reacted to returning black soldiers and growing populations of black migrants resulting in profound, dramatic demographic shifts, they reacted enforcing and reinforcing the color line with one of its most effective tools, violence. This effective tool of ideology in general, right? And so at least 25 reported riots ripped through American cities: Chicago, Knoxville, Omaha, Charleston, DC, Baltimore, Elaine, Arkansas, and New York. And so black people called this stream of racial violence the Red Summer, another pithy metaphor characterizing the blood flowing in the streets. For black people, 1919 was a year of disjunctures and upheavals, but also a year of reminders. And that reminder was racial violence was not a Southern phenomenon, it was not regional, it was national and global. So if you are in a new place, Chicago, New York, your place in society hasn't changed, right? And so it would also be that place, though, where many black people would begin to resist like never before, making 1919 a watershed moment for black politics. Black people's resistance to the year of racial violence, as one historian has termed it, had wider and longer antecedents and effects. So ideas and rhetorics of self-determination coming out of Wilson's 14 Points and the Versailles Treaty in 1919, socialist fervor, as we learned about in the presentation, along with post-war labor strikes, women's suffrage organizing, and also black people's long-standing resistance and organizing against lynching since the early 20th century. All of these coalesced, along with the Great Migration, to produce a herald, a resolute black resistance that would inform the next several years. What many of the participants in this resistance would call it was a new Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro Renaissance, but collectively calling themselves New Negroes. So even the name was resistant, right? That they are claiming this newness against an oldness, juxtaposed against what they thought was the old Negro, this pervasive archetype in the white popular imagination as well as white popular media. And so New Negroes fought back figuratively and literally, determined to claim their humanity, assert a modern global outlook rooted in a complex, increasingly complex racial consciousness, and then defend their value and their bodies against real violence with arms. And so radiating much of this new black outlook of resistance was a little community known as Harlem, where you would find a host of activists, organizers, critical newspapers, and leaders from integrationists to socialists to Pan-Africanists to black nationalists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, as was pointed out earlier, Cyril Briggs, Hubert Harrison, Marcus Garvey, Amy Jacques Garvey, Langston Hughes, and of course, Claude McKay. Contemporaries called Harlem the Mecca of the New Negro, and it became a nerve center for black activism and art. And just take, for example, Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So he started this in Jamaica in 1914. He immigrates to the United States in 1916. By 1920, 4 years later, he has upward of 4 million members. So this speaks to that level of radicalism, and he's operating out of Harlem, though the membership would grow well beyond Harlem, across urban centers in the US, across the rural South, onto the Caribbean, Central America, as far as chapters in South Africa. So in the wake of the Red Summer, New Negroes were those black people deeply politicized and radicalized in order to present to America and the world not only a blistering critique of the failures of American democracy, failures that were made even more visible by the riots, but also, and more importantly, I think, in terms of the enduring legacies of 1919, to present to America and the world a uniquely black and diasporic political theory of democracy and modernity, that Western democracy in its future was doomed if one has to die to live as a citizen.
I think I'm here for comedy relief. Everything that has been said now is the complete history that surrounds the character that I'm going to talk about, Emma Goldman. So, so in a way, the bits of history. What I'm doing is writing about Emma and putting history in around her, right, rather than the other way around. So she's a very problematic figure, and I wrote a book about her. So I am going to read parts of that book. It's just a lot easier that way, since I will do a less good paraphrasing job. You don't all know who Emma Goldman is. She's a primary American anarchist. In fact, actually, Emma really belongs to world anarchism. She was born in 1869 in the Russian Empire. Poor, itinerant, Jewish, the whole story. Grew up in harrowing circumstances. Believed that America was better. Came to America at the age of 16. Went to work in a factory in Buffalo, which was in fact worse than anything she'd worked in Russia. And she experienced fully the dehumanization of America, of industrialization in the 19th century. And she became a kind of anarchist who thought of themselves as world revolutionaries. People like Emma were all over the world then, really everywhere. Russians, Italians, Jews, Irish, everywhere. And to a very large degree, the places in which they lived were places that they perched in. You know what I mean? Yeah, they perched in America or London or France or any of the places. They thought of themselves as comrades in a world revolution. Nevertheless, Emma Goldman lived in the United States for more than 30 years. She could have become a citizen easily. A number of people were willing, if not wanting, to marry her in order to provide her with citizenship. But she was an anarchist through and through and through, and anarchists did not get married. So she didn't get married, and she didn't have a passport. So Emma, so here's America. She becomes this anarchist, and she becomes a thrilling public speaker, absolutely thrilling. She was not a great thinker by any stretch, but she had that personality that is so inspiring. It could inspire anybody to move mountains. That was really her great glory. And she started as a very young woman, came to New York City, quickly made attachments to, first met Alexander Berkman. They were both in their early 20s. And they went to the revolution, So she was in and out of jail from 1893 on. It meant nothing to her. She was always prepared to go to jail. And she wrote, she talked, she traveled all over the country. She took up every single cause going, and it was a life, a full, thrilling life, which went on, actually, in this country through the 1930s, one way or another, until the Second World War. Until then, many people in many forms could live the life of a radical, a working radical, and feel that way. You saw from the the PowerPoint presentation, the picture of Mother Earth. Mother Earth was Emma's baby. It was a magazine which put out, it was, you know, one of the many socialist, communist, anarchist magazines. There were hundreds of them. And you saw some of them, The Masses, The Liberator, etc. So Mother Earth was their thing, and it was wild. I mean, it was wildly insurrectionary. It was bolder than all of them really put together for a very long time. She traveled constantly on behalf of the magazine because they were always threatened with bankruptcy. So then this group around her and Mother Earth were her great inner circle. These were the people with whom she lived her life. All right, so I've fished around in this chapter for the relevance of Emma in relation to 1919. I headed it, which was something I hardly ever did. In 1927, Eugene O'Neill wrote a letter to Sasha Berkman. Alexander was called Sasha. To Sasha Berkman, and he said, "As for my fame and your infame, I would be willing to exchange a good deal of mine for a bit of yours. It's not hard to write what one feels as truth. It's damned hard to live it." The 1917 sedition trial of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, which ended with a 2-year prison term for each, followed by deportation, ranks among the more egregious events in the history of political repression in the United States. For thousands of Americans, this was a masquerade that was going on where the intensity of interest in security, national security, masqueraded as protection of democracy. So the trial went on for a long time, and then they were charged. In the courtroom, the day that they were charged, was John Reed. And Reed wrote, "Who that heard it will ever forget the feeling of despair he experienced when Judge Mayer charged the jury, 'This is not a question of free speech.'" That's all it was a question of. "For free speech is guaranteed under the Constitution, but free speech does not mean license." Margaret Anderson, editor of the Little Review, assured her readers that John Reed's despair was not confined to radicals. One newspaper reporter told me that this trial was making a good anarchist of him. A university professor who came to all the hearings and told me that he had always had a respect for the law until now, one of the biggest lawyers in the city, said the prosecution hadn't a leg to stand on. A recognized intellectual remarked, "Russia never had cause for such rebellion as we are now facing." In a state of near hysteria, the government enacted one repressive law after another. I'm telescoping what's already been said. Each one more abusive of guaranteed civil rights than the last. First came the May 1917 Selective Service Act that made it a felony to object to conscription. A month later, the Espionage Act. And then after that, the Sedition Act, which all they were all about was no one was to speak a word of adversity in relation to the government ever. Then in October, when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, both state and federal governments, as Emma put it, turned the country into a lunatic asylum, with wholesale raids and arrests and sentences of incredible severity being carried out daily. The entire leadership of the IWW, International Workers of the World, the whole leadership, 165 of them, were all arrested in a shot. Bill Hayward, who was a famous leader, he was up for like 25 years in jail. He skipped bail, got to the Soviet Union, and never came back. That same year, Eugene Debs went to jail for 10 years. And in September, this is 1917, the September 1917 issue of The Masses was confiscated, and its editorial board indicted on charges of undermining the war effort. the legal action eventually forced the magazine to cease publication. And all of this was happening on the basis of opinion, written or spoken, but opinion only, as the cultural critic Randolph Byrne said presciently that year, in a time of faith, skepticism is the most intolerable of insults. It was evident to all of us at the Mother Earth group. Ben Reitman, Emma's lover and colleague, wrote years later that the jail and maybe the gallows were before us. Many took cover. Some found safety in joining the army, others in getting married, others in going to Mexico, and still others by changing their names and their nationalities. Not so with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. They became more revolutionary, more violent, and less compromising. One of the reasons that Goldman and Berkman became, as Reitman put it, even more daring than they had been before was the alarm and contempt they felt in the face of the near total cave-in of the liberal intelligentsia, most of whom turned patriotic, quote unquote, overnight. They were not alone in feeling this contempt. Randolph Byrne wrote a blistering piece called The War and the Intellectuals, echoing the sentiment. But they, Emma and Sasha, were almost alone in acting on it. This happened during McCarthyism, too. I don't have to tell you, but I will. The day after the Selective Service Act was passed, Emma and Sasha called a mass meeting in New York City of the No Conscription League, an organization they had founded a year earlier. And on May 18th of that year, 8,000 people packed the Harlem River Casino, which was like an uptown Madison Square Garden, to hear the war denounced as an imperialist venture being fought on behalf of capitalists at the expense of workers. Remember, the speakers enjoined, at the end of every bayonet is a worker. Emma herself, it was said, spoke, quote unquote, as if possessed by divine fire. The June 1917 issue of Mother Earth carried the complete text of the No Conscription Manifesto, and on the magazine's cover was a drawing of a coffin. This was one of the most famous covers in magazine history in America. It was a coffin draped in black, surrounded by the words, "In Memoriam, American Democracy." On the 15th of that month, Emma and Sasha were arrested in the magazine's offices by a U.S. Marshal accompanied by 12 city policemen. What did Emma do? She changed into a royal purple dress, grabbed a small toilet case, always at the ready for police station confinements, and a copy of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A book was also always at the ready, and marched out, head held high. Next day, she and Sasha were formally charged with conspiring to obstruct the draft. Meanwhile, their office, like the offices of every radical organization in the country, was being raided. Letters, manuscripts, mailing lists, files, records, addresses, checkbooks were all confiscated and lost forever. But their bail, set at $25,000 each, a lot of money then, was met by liberal supporters, and no sooner were they out on the street than they called a meeting. This is while they were on bail. Both Sasha and Emma conducted, once they got to sorry, I skipped too much here. Once they got to the trial, once they were, I'm losing words. Once they were in court, both Sasha and Emma conducted their own defense. And in the eyes of all, including the judge, each performance was a masterpiece of reasoned eloquence. Emma spoke for an hour. She reminded her listeners that in times of crisis, like the one they were now facing, many good people are compelled to stand outside the law when that law goes against the higher dictates of a humanist conscience. Jesus, Socrates, Galileo, none had been within the law when they stood their ground on behalf of the truth as they saw it. By the same token, the founding fathers of the American Revolution had defied the law in order to declare the law unjust. And certainly the great Civil War abolitionists had done the same thing, giving their life's blood to fight slavery when slavery was the law of the land. Each of those historic actors had challenged the law for the sake of speaking the truth, when to speak was to risk all. Turning directly to the jury, she added herself to this list. And Emma said, in conclusion, even if we were convicted and found guilty, and the penalty was that we be placed against a wall and shot dead, I should nevertheless cry out with the great Luther, here I am and here I stand, and I cannot do otherwise. The verdict was guilty. Nonetheless, being able to speak their piece in court left both Sasha and Emma feeling exhilarated. The August 1917 issue of Mother Earth, the magazine's last, carried an advertisement on the back cover for the trial and speeches of Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, the complete account of the arrest, trial, and conviction for their activities in the anti-conscription agitation, with their remarkable speeches in the U.S. District Court of New York, July 1917. That issue became a collector's item. And today, people pay thousands for it. And inside the magazine, Berkman and Goldman wrote their friends, "We are going to prison with light hearts. To us, it is more satisfactory to stay behind bars than to remain muzzled in so-called freedom." At this moment, they felt they could take on anything. Emma Goldman entered the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City on February 8th, 1918. No sooner was she released from prison on September 27th, 1919, than she, along with Sasha, was rearrested and brought to court by J. Edgar Hoover, newly appointed head of the General Intelligence Division of the Bureau of Investigation, still operating in the Justice Department, who persuaded the government to begin deportation proceedings. It was Hoover who absolutely orchestrated their deportation, not just theirs, many. A mass of stunned and sorrowing friends threw a farewell party, at which Sasha, upon learning that Henry Frick had just died, Sasha had tried to assassinate Henry Frick, right? He remarked dryly, "Deported by God." And on December 21st, they, along with 247 other foreign-born radicals, were placed aboard the Buford, a barely seaworthy relic of the Spanish-American War that convinced its passengers the U.S. government cared not whether they lived or died. 28 days later, the leaky ship docked at a Finnish port, whereupon the deportees were transferred to a train that took them to the Russian border. Once on Soviet soil, they were met by a government committee which greeted them warmly and welcomed them to the people's state. So there they were in Soviet Russia. So now I just will interpolate here and say, don't forget they were anarchists. And the anarchists were not wanted in Soviet Russia. Lenin hated them, one and all, and jailed almost all of them. Emma Goldman gets to Moscow, and she looks around, and she says, "What's going on here?" And she's immediately in a rage and opening her mouth left, right, and center. Many of the American radicals were there then, John Reed and a whole bunch of people from the masses and from other places. And they were all in a state of, thrill. You know that history, how long it took for American radicals to come to terms with Soviet dictatorship. But Emma saw it immediately. She saw the gathering of power in the party. She saw the inequality of treatment, which was denied, but was clearly abundantly there. She saw the thousands of people who were being declared enemies of the state. The upshot was Emma and Sasha left the Soviet Union 23 months after they had arrived. One more year, and in all probability, they would have ended up in a labor camp in Siberia. Now they were truly in exile, stateless in every sense of the word. That's it.
Thank you for such wonderful presentations. We have about 15 minutes left, so maybe we'll talk for a few minutes as a panel and then open it up to questions from you. I will confess that I've had a lot of trouble over the last year trying to figure out what is the central message of the year 1919. I've been editing a lot of different pieces coming in, and there's no doubt that the United States, after the war, is a conservative country. There is prohibition coming, terrible suppression of radical movements, as we've just heard, and race riots. At the same time, women are getting the vote. Cities are exciting places. Young writers and artists are coming up with exciting things to say, nowhere more so than here in New York City. So how do we fix the center of American opinion? What is the mainstream? I've had a lot of trouble thinking through that myself. Steve mentioned the Abrams decision, which we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of. And in that decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's a very old justice of the Supreme Court, comes out with a robust dissent, defending free speech and much affected by his young friends at the New Republic. So it's a volatile time, which makes it a very interesting time. And how would you help our audience think through where is the center of American opinion? Maybe Steve, do you mind taking that?
Mike, yes, okay, I've got the mic now. Boy, that's a great question, and 100 years from now, we may be asking something similar about today.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a few quick thoughts, not in any particular coherent order. I mean, this is the moment, right, where traditionally progressivism dies or becomes something much more very disappointing, and if you're on the left or on the liberal side of things. Let me just leave it. Let me just say something very brief. The war is so transformative, and just a factoid here about World War I in America, because remember, the war began in 1914 in Europe. We didn't get involved until the spring of 1917. Woodrow Wilson actually got reelected, being too proud to fight, sort of advocating American neutralism. It's not our problem, and then decides a few months later that German, submarine warfare and so on is intolerable, and we're going to, because they're attacking American cargo ships, we're going to get in the war. Just a factoid. I grew up watching on television, as many of you did, American GIs wandering through the jungles, of Southeast Asia. From 1964 to 1973, about 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. We were in World War I a little over a year and a half, and over 120,000 Americans died. Yet somehow the sort of gung-ho-ness of the period sort of obscures that. I'm sort of free associating here. Let me just say one thing. The war, as we've heard, generally really created a stridency, a militarism that in a year and a half is not exhausted. And it really boils over into 1919 and beyond. And I'll leave it at that. I want other people to talk.
Anyone else want to jump in on?
Well, I can jump in with two quick things, maybe making links with today. I think one thing to conclude from 1919 is that the United States is simply a place of competing political traditions. And there are moments in history, and 1919 was one of them, in which those traditions almost go to war with each other. And so I think that claims about American history that one thing is un-American, or that certain aspects, whether you're on the left or the right, those are claims that people like to make. But I think that's certainly one lesson of 1919, that this is a country of deeply held and ferociously held political traditions that don't always align with each other, and there are moments where they come into conflict. I would say the other, to the degree that 1919 and the early 20s really do turn out to be moments of serious defeat for the left, or at least of retreat for the left, for labor. They are also these incredibly creative years, as you say, that actually the years of being out of power, being in retreat, being on the defensive, being part of some sort of imagined resistance, proves to be incredibly generative. You see new institutions, you see new movements emerging, and so that it's just not always very clear when you're standing in a moment in history, and I'm obviously speaking to our own moment a little bit as well. It's not always clear what the ramifications of a certain moment of defeat or crisis or conflict are going to be.
I was struck also.
I'd like to say
Oh, sure.
something. And you?
Yeah, no, go ahead. No. So real quick, for Black Americans, I mean, that center is going to be Harlem in many ways, even though the Negro Renaissance is cropping up and emerging in places like Chicago and Philly, St. Louis as well. But a lot of that has to do with Harlem having received such large numbers of Black migrants from the South, West Indian migrants too. And there's this other side of it that, as I mentioned about race riots, so even though Harlem is this center, it's also a diasporic perspective to it too. Not to mention that West Indian immigrants are there. That racial violence is helping to shape a racial consciousness that reaches far beyond Harlem, far beyond the U.S. as well. So you have a number of radicals, intellectuals who are living in Harlem. Much of the intellectual and artistic production that characterizes the New Negro movement is emanating from Harlem. But you're also going to see these cross currents between activists in Harlem with activists in Chicago and activists in other parts of the U.S. that try to build national movements. And so Garvey is a really good example of this, that his movement is spreading outside of Harlem to the rural South, on through Central America, the Caribbean, and even through parts of Africa. So much so that our good friend Hoover deports him too eventually. Jails him and then deports him too. So Harlem becomes a focal point as well for government surveillance.
Vivian?
Okay. I'll start backwards, like you attempted to do in our own moment. I'm a second wave feminist. The 1970s were very important to me. They were my politics. I grew up in the left and went through many other kinds of movements, but feminism was my politics. And the liberationist movements were my politics. And I lived to see what I am firmly convinced is the backlash against those liberationist movements. Those movements unleashed incredible anxieties in America. And those anxieties were met first with, you remember the phrases, abortion and gay rights, right, gay marriage, and all that hysteria. And I believe it's because America, perhaps sitting on a tinderbox, and who knows why, ready to explode and end with Donald Trump. But it was the liberationist movements that were the catalyst. They opened the world to that, and to that, and to the awful hysteria that we're still caught up in, and which makes people think, people like us and everybody else, can the democracy survive? Can the American democracy actually go on surviving all of its ups and downs, all of its bursts and explosions, which are many, like everyone else's in the world, because there is no steady in us, inside the citizenry anywhere. America is amazing that it remains as law-abiding as it does, and that we're not all lined up and shot or sent to prison, even at this moment. Well, by the same token, at the turn of the 20th century, modernism had crossed the ocean from Europe, And its first stop was in Greenwich Village, where a few hundred people, and then ultimately a few thousand people, were gathered. And they were composed of all kinds of people, including Emma, and all kinds of feminists, including Margaret Sanger, Max Eastman, Walter Lippmann, Isadora Duncan, thousands of these few hundred people who wanted to make a revolution in consciousness. And the radicals joined them. Those are times like now, like the 60s and 70s even, when it seems as if politics and art and the humanities, politics and art and intellection, they're all interchangeable, and transgression. They're all interchangeable. In a time of social rebellion, they all take color from each other. So that, in these sedition trials, there were many people who were artists. They were not political. That, I believe, is a very strong part of the hysteria that overtook the country. And we see that it happens again and again and again because these elements are constantly in a volatile state, is my brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
So we have a few minutes left, not too many. Why don't we take questions? And I will recommend that only one panelist answer one question so we can get as many questions from you as possible. So why don't we try for 2 or 3 questions, then we may run out of time. But yes, sir.
Do you see modern-day New York as being as potent an incubator for radicalism as it was in 1919?
Did you all hear the question?
Could you just repeat the question?
Is modern-day New York as potent an incubator of radicalism as it was in 1919? That sounds like Steve.
Next question.
Okay, yep, ma'am, in back.
Mr. Jaffe, I was very interested, thank you, in the demographic map that you showed us in what you called the supposedly safe white Anglo-Saxon enclave.
Yeah.
Was it really all that safe, or were there young people in particular within it who identified with the radical movement and became part of it, or even part of the leadership, as the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, for example, did in Ireland around the same time?
Is your question about Anglo-Saxons
Yes.
joining? Sure. I mean, yes. I mean, bringing it back to Greenwich Village, I mean, a lot of the radicals and artists and quote-unquote bohemians who went back and forth between artistic modernism and political radicalism, as Vivian was talking about, were actually native-born white Protestants.
Yes, absolutely.
And yes. And so the answer is, in terms of sort of the cultural politics or the ethnic politics, there were plenty of people who were not, Eastern or Southern European immigrants or African American who leaned to the left in various shades of opinion. Let me just say something else quickly about those maps, though. John Trevor, the guy who basically was responsible for them in 1919 for the state investigation in New York, and would then end up being a great lobbyist for restricting immigration. I had a professor in graduate school who was an Anglo-Saxon, actually, who said the 1924 law, 15 years, right, in advance, sent people back into the gas chambers. And that's exactly what it did. But my point here is, in 1919, when John Trevor helped draft those maps, he was a military intelligence officer during the war. He was a lawyer, blue blood, and he actually wired or wrote to Washington, to the War Department, in either 1918 or 1919, asking for 6,000 Springfield rifles, because he was afraid the Bolsheviks, the Jewish Bolsheviks of the Lower East Side, were about to explode in revolution, right? And so there's a connection here. My point is simply that the ethnic and quote-unquote racial politics, also on that map, Liberty Hall is one of the places in Harlem. That's one of Garvey's main centers in Harlem, is one of the dangerous places on that map. So the broader point is simply, yes, there were white Protestants who were all over the place in terms of these politics, but the people who ultimately had the leverage into the 20s had this very bigoted ethnic politics.
Why don't we take one last question, and then we'll all be around for the reception. Happy to take other questions.
Several of you mentioned, or a couple of you actually mentioned in passing women's suffrage as well as prohibition, which both came to fruition in 1919, 1920. So my question is, how did those two movements play into the tumult, or the tumultuous times of 1919 in New York City? What was the interplay there?
Wait, between suffrage and prohibition?
No, suffrage, prohibition. How did suffrage and prohibition, which were very timely in 1919, 1920, that time, play into this sort of overall sense of tumult, and how they related, if at all?
If at all is the crucial phrase there. As it happens, I'm writing a review of a biography of Crystal Eastman, Max Eastman's sister, who was a dynamite social reformer, born also in the 1880s and went through that whole period. She was a great suffragist. She was a great labor legislation person. She was a great anti-militarist. She had a passion for all this reform, and they were all at each other's. They were all at each other's heads. They were all. Each of these groups, as I've known for a long, long time, each of them, just as Beverly was pointing out about how the left always divides against itself, each of them acted as if they were alone in the country, and they hardly ever made common cause. The suffragists were enraged that anybody would support Wilson after all his betrayals, but lots of people who were interested in other kinds of reform, who were also suffragists, did. It's like it's been like this forever in America, really forever. I wrote a biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in the course of which I came to see the country is divided like in three. There were three huge movements going on at the same time. One was American pragmatism, right? And after the Civil War. And then there was suffrage. And then there was transcendentalism. Emerson, they were all alive at the same time. You wouldn't know they were in the same country. You wouldn't know it. It's amazing how it...
Beverly, did you want to say something?
Well, I would say the only other thing that I would add about both suffrage and prohibition is that they were very much products of the war. And so one of the things that really helps to propel suffrage, battle for suffrage has been going on for more than half a century at this point, are a set of claims about the war, about war service, about democracy, and the mobilization of some of those claims, in addition to some rather militant activism in the end about suffrage. And one vote in Tennessee, we should note the Tennessee legislature is the last ones to vote, and there's one guy who says, he votes because his mother told him to. So there's also just institutional politics, but with prohibition as well, that a lot of the concerns that come out of the war about the health and the safety of soldiers, particularly around kind of venereal disease and immorality and prostitution and all of these things that are thought to be wrapped up in the consumption of alcohol. I think it's less, those things finally happen in 1919 and 1920, but I think the real kind of push politically and institutionally comes out of the war effort.
Is it true, could we say that prohibition actually helps Harlem because it makes it so exciting to find places to get a drink? Does it backfire that way?
There were a number of black women activists who were involved in the suffrage movement. And the suffrage movement had been involved since the early 20th century, if not late 19th. And many of them are inspired by the movement. They're working within the movement, but at the same time, sometimes, I'm thinking of Ida B. Wells, I'm thinking of Mary Church Terrell, they're pushed out of the movement. If not pushed out, at least relegated because they're black. And so So in these ways, there were black women activists who were just as motivated as white women activists who were involved in the suffrage movement. But in other ways, these same black women, the National Association of Colored Women, for example, who sort of latch on to new Negro politics as their new venue and medium for activism when some of that organizing around suffrage seems to sort of repel some of them.
Well, that seems like a good place to end our part of the evening, but we'd like to talk to you individually, and we'll all be around during the reception. So thanks very much.
Anti-prohibition, since we have wine back there.